The 35mm focal length. It might be most photographers' favorite focal length. It's famous for its storytelling ability, where it's able to capture enough of the surroundings to give context to the picture, but not so much as to confuse and lose the point of the image completely. In this video, I'm going to teach you my favorite compositional techniques with a 35mm focal length on a full frame camera. And as I go through these, I'm not just going to explain what they are, I'm going to show you how they work in practice and why they matter, and how that can elevate your photography immediately. The techniques I'm going to show you here particularly suit the 35mm, but I think anything from 24 to 50 can use these techniques well. It's just that you're going to get sort of diminishing effects as you go beyond these ranges. That's because 35mm sits in this sort of Goldilocks zone, because it's not too wide like 24mm, where you start getting distortion and too much of the environment creeping in. But it's not so tight like 85, for example, where you can lose the context of your background and the subject. It just balances everything beautifully. And it's because it feels so natural to our eyes. It's actually very similar to how we see the world. The first technique that I'm going to use is shooting from a low angle. That means shooting from about waist height, maybe a little bit lower even. This creates a very dynamic and impactful image, and it makes our subject look powerful and confident. You'll see this technique get used a lot in fashion photography because it really helps emphasize the clothing as well. They want to give that feeling of authority to the person that they're photographing, so they look dominant and strong in the picture. It's not just the feeling of power either. Shooting from a low angle, it stretches the lines in the body, and it even helps clean up the backgrounds. You can see in this picture here of Himanshi that this low angle, it gives a strong feeling to the image. Even though the pose is soft, it still feels commanding. It feels more like the image has purpose, and this gives it a much more commercial kind of feeling. In this image, you can see how the low angle again pushes the dynamics of the image and makes the model feel striking, and it makes you pay attention to the clothing. It's also important to note that this look makes the subject's head look smaller. So this kind of technique is generally better to use when you want to emphasize clothing, such as in fashion photography, or you want to make the subject feel more dominant to the viewer, which could work in a portrait of a business person or someone who's important and has authority. Using a lower angle would increase the perception of power. In busy urban environments, for example, shooting from a lower angle allows you to use the sky as a background or the tops of buildings, which simplifies the frame, and it lets your subjects pop more. Now, depending on the height of your subjects, you may need to get down lower, or maybe you can be a little bit higher. It's not a one size fits all rule. So use this low angle technique when you want to create striking and memorable images. And importantly, just don't be afraid to experiment. Even a slight adjustment lower than your normal shooting height can make a really surprising difference to the way that your work looks. And what you'll see if you try to do this with longer focal lengths, you can do it, but you just kind of get this diminished effect. And in this picture that I've taken of Amber here, and that's lessening the effect. When you move further away from your subject and zoom in using a longer focal length, firstly, the perspective flattens. Distance between objects appear compressed, so background elements look closer to the subject. And that's because you're narrowing the field of view and minimizing perspective distortion. That means you end up with a less dramatic effect when you change the height of the camera when you're further away. Now, the next technique definitely works at every focal length. However, at 35mm, I think it gives the 35 its classic look. That's to shoot at your subject's eye level, and it makes the picture feel incredibly well balanced. It just has this authentic feel to it. A lot of your vertical lines will become straight, so they won't be leaning forwards or backwards. And this helps create the cohesive feel in the image. This is probably the technique that I've used most often at 35mm, and what the 35 does, as opposed to say a 50, is it allows us to get a little bit closer and show more of the environment around the subject, and that gives us context and atmosphere. It tells a richer story without feeling cramped. And there's something else here too. If you look at this picture here, we don't have the same dominant feeling we had at a lower angle. Our subject feels more approachable, they feel more like a real person, whereas the lower angle made them feel more like a model. At eye level, especially at 35mm, your images feel like you're inviting the viewer sort of into a conversation. It's as if you're making the photograph with them, not of them. It feels intimate but natural and not forced. So use this technique of shooting at eye level to create images that are very much like how we see the person in real life. I'd use this technique when I'm doing a photo shoot where I want to represent the person as their true selves. I'm careful not to shoot above eye level, As we'll see later, this creates a very different feeling to the images. And I think it's important to point out that while 35mm is very flexible and allows you to create a lot of different looks, it's important that we are intentional and understand the differences and moods that these looks create. Now, the next technique kind of uses the previous two, and it's not something that really changes the height of the camera, but it's more of a compositional idea. This idea I came across quite early in my wedding photography career because it was very popular amongst wedding photographers. Why? Well, because it gives you this excellent feeling of balance in the picture, and that is to use a centered composition. I like this at various different focal lengths, but particularly at 35. It's my favorite focal length to use this at, and 40mm and 50 a little bit as well. And it's placing your subject dead center. This may feel like it's going to be boring or that it won't work, but actually it works incredibly well. What it allows is your story to build around the outside of the picture, but it also draws us in immediately. So whilst a lot of people are using the rule of thirds, and the rule of thirds can work really well a lot of the time, whereas this centered composition does a couple of things. Whilst it draws our attention to the subject, it allows that breathing space around them. But the other thing that it does is it does away with the clutter that you can get at the lower parts of your frame. I particularly like using this technique at 35mm when I'm in a portrait orientation like this, because often in most locations, the upper part of the image is simpler and cleaner, and it's an easier composition than the lower part of the image. Lower parts of the image have pavements, railings, lots of things that could be good but might not be. There can be a lot of visual clutter. We can get around that by, instead of using the rule of thirds, using this centralized composition technique. It's actually very popular in outdoor portrait photography, especially in built-up areas. Now, the next technique that I like to use works especially well with 35mm lenses, and that is to get a little bit closer to your subject and then just tilt down a bit. With 35mm, this is going to exaggerate the effect. And what this does is it makes our subject look softer, more emotionally open, and it gives us a more emotionally engaging portrait. It also diminishes the lower part of the body. This can be good when you're photographing larger subjects, but you can use this with any type of subject. It gives this more approachable kind of look. You can really see the difference here, can't you? It's quite noticeable. There's something really interesting that happens when you use a 35mm lens and you move in close to your subject. First, because you're physically close with a wide-angle lens, you're getting that classic perspective distortion. The parts of your subject that are closer to the lens, like the head and the shoulders, will feel slightly exaggerated, while the rest of the body recedes away from you. This makes the subject appear smaller in the frame, a bit more vulnerable. Secondly, many 35mm lenses have this way of rendering the subject at close distances. There's this sort of gentle fall off, and the lens starts to open up the space around your subject. That extra bit of breathing room adds to this soft, almost painterly quality. So when you put all this together, the close distance, the wide angle perspective, and the downward angle, you end up with an image that feels more gentle. So let me show you the differences side by side between a low angle, eye level, and then shooting from above and tilting down. And you can see we get such a different variety of pictures. This is the way that I like to use 35mm. Using all of these different angles, it allows us to create these different feelings and moods with our subjects. And it makes it such an expressive focal length to use. And that, I think, is why we're drawn to it so much. One of the things, though, you need to be very careful with when you're using 35mm is because there's quite a lot in the frame, you need to be very deliberate. It's very easy to have straight objects and then things in the background that you didn't really intend to be there. So you need to be a little bit more cautious about where you put your subject or how you frame your images in general. It's always a good idea to take a moment, scan the frame and ask yourself, is there anything in here that's fighting for attention with my subject? Sometimes even just moving a step left or right cleans up the background completely, and that strengthens your composition massively. Now, it's all very well having these ideas of how to use your 35mm lens, but when you get back and you look at your pictures, you're going to need to edit them. I have 3 editing masterclass workshops online available for you to watch. Once you sign up, you can watch them anywhere you want, as many times as you want. There are no hidden secrets in the world of editing. There are only the tools that are available, but understanding how to use them properly and having a really good grasp of what's possible and what to do with them and why you're using them to do those things is absolutely critical to editing your work really well. All of the pictures you see in the world, especially the ones that have stood the test of time, have all been edited. Editing is one of the key parts of being a photographer, and understanding the editing process well actually affects the way that you take pictures, especially when it comes to things like exposure. Whilst you can spend years looking at one tutorial then another online, if you sign up for my workshops, you'll be able to fast track yourself and get ahead really quickly, because they are comprehensive and they take you through everything I do the way that I do it. So if you like the look of my work, check out my online workshops. The links are in the description down below. Head there, click the link and check them out. I think you'll find them really valuable. Anyway, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.